open for questions. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, Barbara Lippiat from the U.S. Government's National Institute of Standards and Technology. My question is for the third speaker from TEKLA, but it kind of relates to the excellent speeches by our first and second speakers. I'm wondering if your company has given any thought to adding, I don't know if you call it an object, but an information module in addition to the architectural, in addition to the structural and the MEP, containing the life cycle environmental information associated with a structure, its construction and its maintenance. I mean, I know I've heard of efforts in Australia and in the United States in this area. It just seems like it's something that could really help us track and design for sustainability.
In answer to your question, the answer is yes. But really, we went on the fourth dimension, but any dimension can actually be put within the model itself. And I totally agree with you. The model can be NDs, we like to say. The fifth dimension is normally taken to be cost, but any dimension can be applied to the object. So a lot more intelligence can just be there, whether it's in attributes or further information. Again, it can be linked to information on websites like your own website, etc. So we can actually put the information within there. And as you saw from the diagram, the idea is to build this information. So initially we're only talking about project information, but anything could be included, to be quite honest.
Hi. This is Jeremy Snyder from New York. I guess one of my questions is for Mr. Simon Lay from WSP on performance analysis for kind of code interpretations. We do the similar kind of thing for my company as well, and just your reaction on, I guess, obviously we all know when there's an optimal time to get involved for this kind of process, and proaction versus reaction. A lot of engineers are taught to react opposed to proact, and there's always an optimal time to get involved, but often if it's too early, you end up having additional costs and additional impacts on architecture that obviously are not going to be well taken on by somebody who has a vision. So just your general thoughts on that process.
Thanks so much for the question. I mean, that's a very significant point. We often find when we work with clients that the first time we work with them, they come to us because they've had a problem. They've reached a significant point in the project which they can't get round. It's either on site or still in the late stage of design. The next time the client comes to us, they're normally coming a lot earlier. And then the third time they come to us, sometimes you say they come too early. In fact, we've discovered that there's probably never a time when it's too early. Some of the most successful designs we've done, we've actually worked with the architect at the same time, if not before the structural engineer was even involved. We've actually influenced building form, we've influenced planning operations, planning design. We've influenced building mix on mixed-use sites and master planning, and a big growth area for us is master planning support, realising that the performance-based approach to the buildings, if you carry that back into the master planning design, the savings and the safety margins that can be achieved there are very significant. So I would say that there really isn't a too early a time, but at the same time that the architect particularly is thinking about the building height, the cores, the general form of the building. If they're going to be talking to a structural engineer, they'll often start talking to a vertical transportation engineer to work out how big the cores are going to be. And the common constraint seen on that is fire safety. And people have a habit of putting building cores at a certain distance and certain locations for fire safety reasons, and then trying to work around that. On the Beetham Tower, we gave our structural colleagues a bit of a headache when we didn't need 2 building cores for the top half of the building. So we could blame them for the extra concrete that had to go in, rather than them just saying it was going to be a staircase there. In fact, it came back as floor area to the client. They got about another 6% of the floor area back from doing that. They could actually use the space inside the core. So as soon as you're thinking about the vertical components of the building, I think involving the performance-based fire engineer is vital at that particular point in time. And it should be a relatively small amount of work. It should be a small input. It shouldn't be high-cost work. But it's that initial steer, that first little nudge in the right direction. It can mean that so many opportunities that might be lost otherwise are actually still open to the architectural and the engineering team. By the time you've got into that design a bit more, then you start to lose some of those opportunities. People think they can't do things because of X, Y, and Z. and our job is to open up those opportunities.
Are there two sets of stairs in that single core?
No, just the one.
Just one?
Yeah.
Wow. How wide is it?
1100 mil.
Amazing.
Yeah. I mean, that's not particularly controversial in the UK to have a single stair. What's more controversial is the fact that it's only at one end of the building, and the fact that that staircase is shared with the hotel portion of the building at the lower half as well.
Amazing. So there's an area of refuge.
No, there's no refuge area. I don't like refuge areas.
Good afternoon, Viren Kapadia. My question is to Mr. Simon. While designing the modern way, here in India and maybe in the Eastern Asian countries like China, Malaysia and other places where Vastu and Feng Shui, so designing that way, how it can be helpful, or maybe ethnic values people they consider apart from the business buildings or the residential high-rise buildings.
I think that's very important. One of the things that clearly comes through when you think about building in different cultures is those cultural drivers tend to lead to different operational demands on the buildings. It's very interesting talking with people and my colleagues who work in China or work in Korea or work in Vietnam, and we talk about the different ways that people respond to instructions in buildings, for example. And that can radically change the way you design for evacuation. And that a lot of that is driven by those cultural drivers. I think the other thing that's very interesting about some of those more traditional design methods or design processes, I suppose, is that the combination between operation and function and design is so very, very important. And that's something, again, I think is very, very important in performance-based design. We don't design a building on the basis of the assumption of how it's going to operate. We can actually think about how the building is going to operate over its lifetime and how that may change over its lifetime, and take those predictions into the original building design. So I think you're right, those cultural ways of designing buildings, I think performance-based design is really integral into that.
My name is Anil Parekh. I represent Godavari Paints. We are providing actually total paint solutions to the industry. When we talk about fire safety, if you could throw some light, because we are looking at this intermittent coatings or whatever we talk to on the steel structures or concrete. What we have observed is why everywhere the standards have been different for the coatings. Now, particularly when we talk on intermittent coatings, other coatings nearly the ASTM, BS standards tally. What we observe is when you go to Europe, there is a different standard, Germany different standard, and you are not in a position to get licenses or the test certificates, which are very costly. So what do you think on this issue?
I used to work in the fire testing industry, so I know quite a lot about the inside of that industry, shall we say. And you start learning that the value of products sometimes isn't their physical qualities. It's whether it's got a certification certificate or not. And there is a whole industry built purely around certification. And that industry has a financial interest in sometimes barring certain competitors from coming in. At the same time, you do see some very strange different standards and ways of doing things. I've seen certain codes where they specify a thickness of paint to be used, and anyone who knows anything about intumescent paints will tell you that different paints have different thicknesses and respond in different ways. In fact, there's a 7-order polynomial expression that describes how intumescent paints work. It's extremely complex, and you can't just apply the same thing everywhere. One of the things that I like about performance-based design is that it's wrong to assume that something that works in one particular standard can be applied somewhere else, but it gives you the opportunity to test how it's performed in that standard and apply it somewhere else. And you can do the same thing with many different building products. So like I say, we hear some people being quite protectionist about their materials and the things they're selling. In fact, it should open up their applications to different markets. I think the other thing is about that we try and work out, as Phil suggested, where we're going to put the paint to get the best value out of it. And there's been some very interesting studies over the last few years, a lot of it funded and prompted on what happened in New York, but some of that was going on before then as well, telling us a lot about the way that buildings really respond to fire And sometimes actually protecting the members doesn't necessarily produce the right structural response to a fire. And sometimes it's better to let certain members soften and weaken because it stops other more catastrophic events happening. And you don't find that stuff written down in the standards. You have to apply the performance-based approach.
Thank you, Simon. Let's have a round of applause for our visitors.